I'm Bob Bourquin, and I was born in Oakland, California, and my parents moved to Oroville in Northern California in 1939, or in 36, but in 1939 I decided to join the Marines to get away from my father, who was rather abusive. In the Marine Corps, we're trained, first of all, as infantry boots. And I went through my training in San Diego and then was interviewed by a group of officers from different specialized units for men that they wanted in their sections. So I was selected after interview for aviation and was assigned to MAG 21, the Marine Air Group, at North Island in the Bay of San Diego, dive bomber squadron. The old planes were the old BG-1s, and very ancient airplane built in the late 20s. Fabric-covered wings, open cockpit. We had to be careful when we got into the cockpits that we didn't put a foot through the fabric. So, but they did carry a 1,000-pound bomb and were quite good at dive bombing. Then in 1942, my group was selected to go to Ewa Field in the Hawaiian Islands. At that time, it was the territory of Hawaii. And we went out to Ewa Field and received new aircraft, the SBD-1, the Douglas Scout Bomber, another dive bomber. And we engaged in several war games out in the islands and daily flights to get us familiar with the plane. In November of 1941, they selected a group of all non-commissioned officers. No one was lower than a corporal or a sergeant. 29 of us under a lieutenant, and we were given a special assignment and ordered to board a transport ship, the USS Wright, and taken out to Wake Island to establish an air base because they were worried about Japanese aggressive moves in the Pacific. The attack at Wake Island was on December 8th, and this is because it's across the date line. The Japanese, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th, but actually it was the 8th of December for us, and they came in 27, what we called Francis class bomber. Came in very low out of a rain cloud. And Wake Island was a very noisy place. And the surf just kept pounding all day long. You couldn't sleep sometimes, the surf was so loud. And so it was very noisy, and the aircraft couldn't be heard over that surf. We were just finishing up morning chow when we heard Major Devereux come out and say, "Man your battle stations. This is an attack. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. And this is the real thing. This is not a drill. And he had a few other comments to make that I won't repeat. But he told us to get it in gear. I had to take the new gasoline truck up to the main fuel depot, which was near the channel. And I was up there supervising the loading of gasoline in drums to take to the airfield. And when the bombers came in, they split into two groups. One group came over the fuel depot, and the other one hit the airfield. And not only did they drop bombs, fragmentary bombs, but the belly gunners opened up with their machine guns and just riddled the whole area with machine gun fire. So anyway, I told my men to take cover, and this formation of bombers flew over, and I laid there and looked up right into the belly of a bomber and watched the doors open and the bombs fall. And I kept saying to myself, Bourquin, you know darn good well if they fall right over you, they're not going to hit you. It's fine to know that, but it's rather scary to live through it because you think those bombs are going to come right on top of you. So we didn't get hit at the fuel depot. But the airfield just got pounded terribly. And I got in my truck and rushed back to the airfield. And when I got there, all I saw was burning debris and bodies. Out of the 62 men in my group, they killed 27 and wounded 2 or 3 others. And all the men that were working around the area where the fuel drums were stored were burned to death. That's where I would have been if I just happened to be at my station. Just mass slaughter. I had this intense hate build up in me and rage. But the funny thing about it, I felt no fear. At that time, it came later. We started working, picking up our dead and wounded and getting things ready for another attack because we knew that we were going to be in for another one. They were only about 600 miles away from us with their major air base at Kwajalein. We could time the bombers. We just, almost like clockwork, we knew when they expect them. And the first guy that would see them would fire 2 shots with his pistol. Our warning system was almost non-existent. We worked all day digging trenches and pits we could use as cover. That night, I remember us gathering around our executive officer, Captain Theron, and taking the roll call. And he read off the names, you know, and guys would say here, and then someone would say, he's not here. And we had several men missing. One was a very good friend of mine who was like a brother to me. And I figured I had 3 sisters. I figured I'll take him home and get him interested in one of my sisters. And the last he had been seen was trying to save our gasoline truck. His name was Quince Hunt. And Quince and Tucker and Mitwalski were on the truck, the last we saw of it. Well, when we finally got to the truck, it was a burned out piece of junk. It had taken a direct hit. And none of these 3 guys were around. And we didn't find them for 10 days. They had jumped off just before the bomb hit and run out into the brush to take shelter. but were machine gunned. Well, we got together with Captain Theron that night, and after the roll call, he started making new assignments. And it was just impossible to just get one assignment. You had several. Well, anyway, he said, Bourquin, I remember when we were at North Island, you drove a truck. And he says, you volunteered to drive the new truck. So I volunteered. This gasoline truck that I was assigned to was a very fancy job, much more fancy than I would need. It had a lot of chrome work on it. It was a big cab-over engine truck, brand new. And so the first thing I thought, I don't want all that chrome. It just sparkled. And I thought, that chrome will be a direct target for some Jap bomber. So anyway, I tried to take the chrome railing off the top of the truck. It had a catwalk around the top. But I didn't have enough of the proper tools to get it off. So I took paint and tried to paint over and camouflage this chrome so it wouldn't shine. Well, one day I'm driving down the road. This was a little time back in the battle. I think it was around the 21st of December. They came in with a large group of ships. I forget how many ships there were, but I would say something like 20 to 30 ships. They had a carrier with them, and they launched carrier planes against us and dive bombers and Zeros. I was driving down the road with this new truck full of gasoline and didn't know what was going on because of the sound of the engine. And one of these Zeros came in on my backside and came in flat and started machine gunning me. And I was told later by my buddies that saw it that the tracers were hitting the top of the tank and glancing off. He was too shallow. And the first awareness I had that I was under attack was one of the Marines that was in a ditch next to the road started firing up over the top of me. And I thought to myself, what the devil's he doing? And he's waving like this and firing at the Zero. And then I looked up and the Zero zipped out. Well, I quickly turned off the road, down over the ditch and into the brush and left the truck running. I just dove and hit it on my hands and knees and just getting out of the way. And this Japanese Zero turned and came down and didn't know that I wasn't still in the cab and just riddled the whole cab, but didn't set the truck on fire. And the whole windshield is blown out and glass all over and bullet holes all through everything. Well, after the attack, I went back to the truck and it was dead, of course. And I swept the glass off the seat and off the dashboard and thought, well, I'll give it a try and see if it'll kick over. I turned the ignition and bam, it started right up. So I drove back to the airfield with this riddled truck. And when I got to the airfield, I was madder than a hornet because my camouflage had worn off and this Zero had spotted me with a chrome railing. So I looked up on a pretty good sized sledgehammer. I was up on the side of the truck knocking this railing off with a sledgehammer, breaking the bolts. And someone said, "Sergeant, what the blankety blank are you doing?" And I didn't know who it was. And I said, "I'm taking this blankety blank railing off." And the truck is a wreck. And then I looked over and I recognized Major Devereux and in his Jeep. And he says, "Sergeant, place yourself under arrest." He says, "You're destroying government property." And he gave me a real reading down, and I'm standing there at attention. And he says, "Dismissed," and drove off, and I saluted. He scared me more than the Jap Zero did. Because, you know, when you get read off by a superior officer, it's really something. But anyway, I finally did knock the railing off, but it didn't do much good. During the Battle of Wake, the 16 days that we fought, we had a terrible time keeping our planes in flying condition. On the first attack, they destroyed 7 of our 12 aircraft. And the funny thing about it was typical Navy, in that they shipped us ashore without the repair books, the manuals for these planes, or the tools. We had tools for dive bombers, and we had bombs for dive bombers, but we didn't even have bombs for these new aircraft. So we took our practice bombs, which we call water bombs, and we took the bands, the attached bands off, and made new bands for these real bombs that didn't fit but were in our arsenal. And then we had no mechanics that really were expert with the Grumman F4, F3. It was a new aircraft. We had one second lieutenant, Lieutenant John Kenny, who had been a mechanic for Pan American Airlines, I think it was, before he came in the Corps. And he was a very good pilot and also a good mechanic. Then we had another mechanic who was pretty good with this aircraft, but he'd been wounded the first day and was in the hospital. And Lieutenant Hamilton, or Sergeant Hamilton, who was an enlisted pilot, was also a very good mechanic. So I have to still be amazed at what a job John Kenny and Sergeant Hamilton did in keeping our aircraft going. We, on the second day of our battle, we had 4 aircraft that we could use. And Hamilton and Kenny would go to the scrap piles, we called them, the planes that were damaged, and take parts and just do marvelous things in making them work on the existing aircraft. On December 11th, the Japanese came in with a force that they figured was going to end the battle right there. They could walk right over us. But their biggest mistake was they didn't bring aircraft carriers. So when we launched our aircraft, our 4 airplanes, we did it in sections, 2 at a time. They would go out with their 100-pound bombs and bomb this task force. Captain Freuler actually dropped a bomb down the smokestack of one of the ships and blew it to Kingdom Come. And they strafed the ships and sunk, we think 3 ships were sunk and several damaged. We were able to shoot down some of the bombers, and the anti-aircraft of the 1st Defense Battalion were able to hit quite a few. The Japanese later gave us credit with knocking down 27 bombers. We figured we were getting our revenge. All of us just felt this intense rage. And every time we knocked a bomber down, there'd be a cheer go up all over the island. And we never thought about the fact that we were taking lives. We just looked upon them as this terrible threat to us. The Japanese task force that had decided that they were going to take us had to turn around and return to their base. So we actually were the only group in the whole battle, all the battles of World War II, to repulse a Japanese landing force. The admiral that was in charge of the landing force, the Japanese admiral, said it was the aircraft mainly that forced him to retreat. On the 11th, they returned, and they returned in force. And it became a real tough thing to survive. They hit us with everything they had. I remember shells. I was sitting out there gassing up a plane one day, and they started shelling us, and the shells come over with their kind of, and they'd hit the beach and bounce over us. And then they sent the dive bombers in, and the Zeros. And there was no place that was safe. I remember running up South Beach, trying to find a hole to jump into. And I saw this hole with 2 guys in it, and I jumped in with them and said, "Get the heck out of this. There's not enough room here. Find another spot." So I got up and I ran about 50 yards and found a rock, and I just kind of molded myself around the rock and watching these bombers stepping their bombs right down the beach. Two men, Corporal Double and Sergeant Gar, the 2 men that told me to find another hole, they received a direct hit. And we couldn't even find enough pieces to fill the basket. So I just couldn't believe my luck, because everywhere I was seemed to get hit heavily, and I would walk away from it. I didn't receive any wound until almost the end of the war, and I was running down the runway trying to escape this plane that was bombing and machine gunning. And I got a piece of shrapnel. I had a piece in the leg and a piece up here in my shoulder. Dug them out myself. It's hard to explain how you exist in something like that. I remember most of all how difficult it was to keep clean. And I remember one time John Blandy and I were driving through Camp 1 later in the battle, and we decided we'd go to what remained of our tents and get clean clothing. And so we went to the Camp 1, and I found my tent, and my bunk was still there, still made, and my fiance's picture was sitting on the bunk, and my foot locker at the end was still in good shape. So I opened it up and got clean underwear, and I thought, gee, Minnie, this is going to be just great. Put on clean underwear. So we went down to the showers, and we're in taking a shower, and just as we got out of the shower and put on our clean underwear, the bombers came over, and they started dropping bombs all over. So we took off running in our underwear, and I went sliding into a ditch, just came out filthy. And I just felt like, do I ever get any clean clothes again, you know? There were times when you'd look around you and all you see was stuff burning and smoldering. And that's when fear would enter in. All Marines trained as infantrymen in their beginning in boot camp. So we were all infantrymen by this time because we had no aircraft to fly. All our aircraft had been damaged. This is where our officers really showed the kind of guys they were. Our major and our executive officer and our pilots went out and met the landing force on South Beach and fought hand to hand. Captain Elrod, we called him Hammering Hank, was killed there. A Japanese, he thought he'd shot and was playing like he was dead. And he got the Congressional Medal of Honor. In my group, I had Corporal Trigo and Sergeant Blandy, and I was with David Trigo, a second lieutenant. He was in charge. So we had 2 boxes of hand grenades, BAR, 2 Thompson submachine guns, and 2 pistols when the Japs made their landing. And what our assignment was, we had 75 cases of dynamite buried in the runway, and we had a generator hooked up to blow it up to keep the Japanese from landing aircraft or dropping parachute troops on the strip. Well, we couldn't get the generator started, and so we had to fight off the Japanese trying to take us over and work on that generator at the same time. And I had to instruct Dave Cleaver, this man that became my best friend. He's gone now. I had to instruct him how to use the weapon because he had never fired a weapon like a Thompson submachine gun. And also Dave, it worried me a bit whether he would be up to, if the Japs jumped in on us and all, because he was a Mennonite, and we'd always wondered about his religious beliefs, whether he would be able to kill somebody. But Dave did very well. He was very brave. But we couldn't blow up the airfield. And the Japs were directing fire, pretty heavy fire on us. And about 100 yards behind us was the 50 caliber machine gun emplacement. And they fired right over our heads. And we had to practically lay down, and they just put a screen of fire right over our heads and and take out these Japanese Marines that were trying to hit us. I was only 150 yards from where they drove these two ships right up on the beach. They landed their Marines right over the front of the ships, just up the beach from them, between my position and the landing force, was this 2-inch gun that had been damaged during one of the bombing raids, and it wouldn't elevate. And a young lieutenant of the 1st Defense Battalion, I believe his name was Hanna, he and a couple of civilians and a couple of Marines took over this gun. None of them ever had fired a gun like this, had no experience at all, didn't know what to do, but they bore sighted in on Patrol Boat 33 as it was coming up the beach. Well, you look down through the barrel and you line up your barrel with the target. And every time they fire, it would knock them off the firing platform. They had no ear protection or anything. Anyway, they put several rounds into this Patrol Boat 33. The two Japanese patrol boats that were going to land these troops were just shot to pieces. And then our Marines that were right on the beach facing the Japanese landing, they were able to side in and take these Marines out with rifle fire and hand grenades. And I threw hand grenades, but I couldn't throw the distance to these ships. But I was able to take out several Japanese troops that had managed to swim through the coral and up onto the beach and starting inland towards us. So they were very determined. One thing you must say about the Japs during the battles, they were very courageous, fanatical. They'd charge right into fire. And I think one of the things that helped us a lot in our hand-to-hand fighting was they didn't seem to want to fire their rifles. What they wanted to do was use their bayonet, like they were conserving their weapon, their ammunition. And when you go up against a United States Marine with a bayonet, you're going to lose. They considered their loss in taking our island was about 5,000 casualties. During the battle, the 23rd of December, the main landing, by the time it started getting light, we realized that we were pretty much surrounded by Japanese troops. It looked like it was going to be impossible for us to retreat to the 50 caliber gun behind us. We still couldn't get the generator working. But what we didn't know was that a great portion of the island had already been surrendered and the men taken captive, and the Japanese placed them directly on the runway. So if we had got our generator working and blown up the airfield, we would have killed many of our own men. Anyway, about daylight, we realized that we were going to really have a tough time of it. About, I think it was somewhere around 11 or 12 o'clock in the day, we saw this group headed towards us down the road. And they got within shouting distance and halted. And it was a Major Devereux and Sergeant Malik, and he held a broom up with a white flag on it. And about 20 or 25 Japanese soldiers with an officer in charge. And Devereux shouted to us, he said, "The island has been surrendered. Lay down your weapons." And I turned to Lieutenant Kenny, or Lieutenant Cleaver, and I said, "Don't surrender, Lieutenant." I said, "The Marines never surrender." And I said, it's a hoax. But anyway, he said, we must surrender. It's a direct order. So I had Charlotte, my fiance's picture, stuck in my waistband with my shirt over it. And I had a lot of .45 ammunition that I just stuck down my neck to get it out of the way. And anyway, we went out of the dugout with our hands up. And just as we went out, I had a hand grenade that I was ready to throw, had the pin pulled on it. So if I dropped it, it was explosive right then. It would ignite. So I rolled it into the dugout as we walked out, and that kind of irritated this surrender group. Anyway, we walked out, and they pulled our shirts up, and all this ammunition fell out, and Charlotte's, my fiance's, picture fell out. And this officer, a lieutenant, reached down, picked up the picture, and shoved it down my waistband again, and said, "Your wife?" And I lied. I said, "Yes." He said, "You keep." He spoke English. So then they made us take all our clothing except our underwear and shoes off. And they tied our hands with telephone wire. And the wire went down between our legs and up around our throat with a slip knot. And if you moved your hands, you'd choke yourself. And they marched just down to the airfield, the main part of the landing strip. And they put us in groups of about 20. And they had 2 guards on foot and a machine gun mounted on a tripod on each group. And I was just in shock, the fact that I was now a prisoner and no longer in control. And I felt terrible shame at surrendering. And finally, this shock began to wear off, and I became aware of the situation. And I looked around, and I saw all this firepower directed on us. Here we were, men in our underwear, and they had superior fire on us. And I said to myself, this doesn't look good. They're going to execute us. And actually, their early orders were, we found out later, had been to execute all prisoners. So anyway, I whispered to the guys around me. I said, each one of you work on the guy's hands in front of you, and we get loose. And I says, I think they're going to kill us. I says, so we'll put up a fight. As I'm working on the fellow in front of me, I got his hands loose, and when I looked at my hands, I had blood all over them. And I wondered where the blood came from. And I looked up, and on this fellow's shoulder. As I looked at it, it just was just oozing blood, something awful. He had a terrible wound right in the shoulder. So I got down and worked off my own T-shirt and made a compress and pushed it against his back. And I told him to push back against me so he could put some pressure on it. Well, this exposed the picture of my fiance. And one of the Japanese guards on patrol around us looked over and saw the picture, and he reached down and grabbed it, opened it up. It was in a folder. Opened it up and spat on it. Threw it on the ground, and he's grinding his heel on it. And I lost control. I did a stupid thing. He didn't know my hands were loose. I did a stupid thing. I came up off the ground with a right cross, and I hit him right in the side of the face, knocked him cold. And he went tumbling over. And his buddy came over and took the bayonet. First of all, he hit me with a butt of a rifle and knocked me silly. And he took the rifle, the bayonet, and put it right at my throat and was going to bayonet me. This all just happened in seconds. And all of a sudden, there's a shout. And this guy with the bayonet pulls the bayonet back and comes to attention. I thought, well, what next? I was all ready. And this officer came over, reached down and picked up the picture, wiped it off on his sleeve, and handed it to me, slapped the one that had bayoneted me, or was going to bayonet me, slapped him and said something to him in Japanese. And he turned to me, he says, "I'm so sorry." And I looked at him, couldn't believe it. I looked at him, and it was the same lieutenant that had allowed me to keep the picture in the first place. So I decided this must be my lucky piece. So and they didn't tie us up again. So then I took the picture and took it out of this cardboard folder and fixed it so it would fit in my shoe, and stuck it in my shoe. And there it stayed for several weeks before I finally took it out. And I thought, I'll never be without this picture. And to this day, this picture has never been away from me. In January 1942, the Japanese decided to take us to Japan and put us in prison there. And the first thing they did, they passed out these mimeographed sheets, which were labeled Commander of the Prison Escort Navy of the Great Empire of Japan, Regulations for Prisoners. And the first was, those prisoners disobeying the following rules will be punished with immediate death. That's getting right to the point. And here were the things you could be put to death for. Those disobeying orders and instructions. Those showing motion of antagonism or raising sign of opposition. Those disordering the regulations by individualism, egotism, thinking only about oneself, and rushing for your own goods. Now, I never did understand that. Those talking without permission or raising their voices. Those walking or moving without order. those carrying unnecessary baggage in embarking, those insisting or resisting mutually, those touching the boat's materials, wires, electric lights, and tools, switches, and so forth, those climbing ladder without order, those showing action of running away from the room or boat, those trying to take more meal than is given to them, and those using more than 2 blankets. So there wasn't much we could do. So they sent us out on barges, and then we had to climb the nets hanging over the side of the ship, going onto the ship. Before I was ready to go, I had a talk with the fellows with me, and I told them to wear all the clothing they could. It was hot. And I says, I'm going to wear this overcoat. And I says, I don't care what happens, but I'm going to wear this overcoat because where we're going is going to be cold. I figured China or Siberia or someplace like that. Well, anyway, we went out on the barges, and just before I left, I had a jar of cheese that I'd been saving, cream cheese, and I ate that whole jar. And it's a good thing I did. It was very binding. We got to the ship, and they ordered us up these ropes. And as we got off the rope ladder, there were Japanese sailors on either side of the aisleway going into this hole or deck. And each one had a broom handle or a club of some sort. And so they beat us as we went in between them, had to run the gauntlet. And I took several good blows, but the overcoat helped. So I was pretty well battered up by the time I got the hole. And they put us in a hole of the ship, a cargo hole, and battened us down. And the hole had each corner of the hole had a 5-gallon can that had been cut off the top, and that was our toilet. And you had to raise your hand and get permission to go to the toilet. Well, this cheese that I'd eaten was a godsend. It constipated me, so I didn't have to. But anyway, for 29 days, I guess, we were aboard the ship. And then they'd come down and pick 2 or 3 guys and make us hang on to the beams across the ceiling, and then they would beat us just at random for nothing. And by the time we got to Japan and China, I was black and blue. And I tried to play dead both the time. And you couldn't believe it. Here there were probably 800 or 900 guys in this one hole, civilians and Marines both. It was so silent you could hear a pin drop. One of the rules, caught talking, you were killed. One of my friends was taken from the hole one day at random, taken up to the top deck. In fact, they took 4 of them. Took it up the deck, and the captain, Japanese captain of the escort group, had them all beheaded on the upper deck and threw their bodies over the side. We didn't know about this until the end of the war. We never ever figured out what happened to our 4 guys. And I think now, thinking back on it, I could have been chosen, just a random selection, and just an act of cruelty. People often ask me what was the hardest thing to endure in a prison camp for 4 years. And it was hunger more than anything else. We were always hungry. We got about 700 calories a day, and a guy like myself needs about 2,400. So it was always, we were always searching for more food and always thinking about our next meal. And you would think that half-starved prisoners, you know, that mealtime would be a time of real joy. But it was one of the most tense, anxious systems or situations that you could imagine. Everybody was concerned about themselves. Will I get my full portion? We had certain setups on how the food was treated. Each section had, I guess it was 32 men in each section, and with a sergeant in charge. We kept our military discipline all through the prison camp. It kept us as a unit. And we would then have 2 men selected as we went around the room in rotation, would go to the galley and get 2 buckets, one filled with what we called Tojo water, which was our soup. We named it after their Emperor Tojo, or their General Tojo. And the other one was a bucket full of rice. The rice mess cook would get a dipper with a cup about like a teacup, and fill it full of rice, and then pat it down and cut off the top with a paddle. And that was your rice ration. And I measured out what the rice would amount to, and each ration amounted to that much rice. This is incidentally my rice bowl, sacred. This bowl served as everything. You can see how the sides are burned. We use these for shaving, bathing, food, you name it. And if we got any little extra ration, we had little charcoal burners that we built out of tin cans and wire. And I remember one time we had a cat outside the electric fence, had an electric fence going around the camp. And there was this stray cat out there. And one of the guys said, boy, that cat would sure taste good over a roasting fire. So anyway, we called the cat in. We said, here, Nico, Nico, Nico. And the cat came under the bottom wire of the fence. And as it hit that wire, sparks flew, and the cat just was electrocuted. So then we called up to the Japanese on the machine gun. He would allow us to go over, and we took a piece of bamboo and knocked the cat off, took him into camp and skinned him, and then divided up the carcass. And I remember how good that cat tasted. I barbecued mine on my charcoal burner. I could hardly wait for it to get done. It just simmering there, it was just so juicy and nice. But I never realized cat was so good. Guys were always looking for other sources of food. We would catch frogs and lizards, snakes, grasshoppers, and we'd eat them. 2 of my buddies started collecting horse hairs. We're stuck in this old stable where we worked. And they would save those horse hairs, and they'd spend hours and hours tying them together, and they made a horsehair net, and they'd stretch it between two barracks, and then scare the sparrows in, and the sparrows would fly in that net. Some of them would fly right through it, just make a hole. And they would get maybe 2 or 3 sparrows, and they would pick them and roast them and eat them. And I remember telling one of them, I said, you guys, you waste more time repairing your net than you do anything else. But they said it was worth it. Then we had, at one time, we started getting this cornmeal, and it was full of mealworms. And the Japanese gave it to our galley cooks to cook. And they would make a gruel, kind of a watery mush with this. And these doggone mealworms be floating around in it. And we used to say, jokingly, we could tell how long a guy had been in a prison camp. We kept getting new prisoners. If you took the worms out and threw them away and ate the gruel, you were a newcomer. If you took the worms out and put them aside and ate them separately, you'd been there quite a while. And if you took the worms out and put them aside, and then ate the worms and threw the gruel out, you were over the hill, which is our expression in the Marine Corps. If you're over the hill, you're just out of it all. They transferred us from a camp called Wusung to Kangwon. They gave us new numbers, and my number was Niichi Juichi. And I was out going to join a work party, and this guard came over to me and poked me with his rifle and said, "Bunko." That means you have to stand at attention, bow, and give your number. And I couldn't remember it. So I said, "Coca-Cola." And he hauled off and hit me in the side of the face, and I lost 4 teeth. Then the interpreter came over and wanted to know what was going on. This was the guy we called the Beast of the East. His name was Ishihara, and he'd been brought up in the Hawaiian Islands. He'd worked as a taxi driver in Honolulu, so he spoke perfect English and understood it, knew all the swear words and everything else, the slang, so you couldn't call him a slant-eyed Jap or make up some name for him. But anyway, he came over and he says, "What's going on?" And the guard explained to him that I hadn't known my number. And he came over to me and he poked his finger at it. He says, "You must never forget number. You have no name, only number. You don't even breathe, own the breath that you breathe. You are a slave of the Japanese. Remember your number." And of course, I've never forgotten it. This is the number. We were supposed to sew these on our shirts, our front shirt. But I worked in the garage in Shanghai for a while, and I stole a piece of aluminum, and I cut a hole in the back and put a little snapshot that I'd gotten in a letter to my wife, from my wife, or my fiancée. And there's my number. The knee is 2, barracks 2, Ichi, section 1, and member of the section, number 11, Juichi. So I never forgotten it. So I became Niichi Juichi for 4 years. Another problem we had with the Japanese, other than food and work habits, was medicine. And I developed a very severe case of asthma. And I'd go down to what we call our sick bay to get something to relieve it, and there'd be no medicine. And I'd have to control the asthma physically myself. And that was a terrible thing to have to do. I just felt like I was choking to death. And lots of times we'd find out that medicine had come in from the Red Cross and the Japanese had confiscated it. They would steal our Red Cross boxes. They just had terrible meanness about them. One of the things they'd do would be take a letter that had come for us and show it to us and say, "You have letter from sweetheart, but you can't have. We won't give it to you yet." And they'd say other things that were insulting. And they'd hold our mail for days on end. I went almost 2 years without receiving a letter from home, yet there was mail down in the office that could have been delivered to me. We had quite a few guys that, one was a civilian. I remember thinking about him. He went crazy, and he thought he was his wife. And he made himself a dress out of rags, and that's all he would wear. And he'd wander around the camp, and he wouldn't go through a gate without someone holding his hand. I felt so sorry for him. He died. Then I had another sergeant, a buddy of mine, Deacon. We called him Deacon because he always read his Bible. And he went through the whole prison 4 years, never received a letter from home, not a single letter. And at night, we sit around reading these letters that we got over and over again. They just became dog-eared. And Deacon would sit over there and watch, and he'd have nothing to read. And one night, we were sitting there, and he's in the corner, and then there's a man here, and then my bunk. And I'm sitting there reading a letter, and all of a sudden, Deacon jumped up, grabbed our great big water jug, and started to hit me in the head with it. And he says, "You stole my letters." He didn't have any letters. And it took 2 or 3 guys to get him off me and hold him. And so I had to explain to him. I said, "Deacon," I said, "you don't have any letters." And I says, "You'll get one tomorrow." And I said, "Just be patient." Near the end of the war, he did receive a letter. And he came over to me and he says, "Bourquin, how did you do it? You guessed it right on the..." He says, "I got a letter." He thought I had predicted this letter coming to him. It was so sad. I'd listen to him at night. He'd be laying over in his bunk and you'd hear him sobbing. One thing the Japanese, I think universally, lack is a sense of humor. And we Americans are always joking around and kidding around. And I remember one time we were out getting ready to put in a big farm garden. And they would work so long, and then they'd say yasame, which you could rest. And during the rest periods, we have what we call bull sessions, where each guy tries to outdo the guy in front of him with an elaborate story. So what we didn't know was our guard, Watanabe, had been told to find out among the prisoners who the farmers were, or ex-farmers, because they wanted people that could know how to plant and so on. So anyway, we start sitting there, you know, and Watanabe said, how many of you were farmers? So we all raised our hands. I mean, and most of the guys were city guys anyway, but we always just go along with anything. So anyway, they start telling stories about their farm life, crazy stories. And then he turned to me, he says, Gunzo, that's Sergeant. Gunzo, what about your farm life? So I thought, well, I'll really do a big one. I said, well, I'm not a low-down dirt farmer like these guys. I was a certified chicken expert, a poultry expert in Petaluma, California. My parents had a big chicken farm with 10,000 chickens, and everything was automated and air-conditioned. And he starts looking at me, you know, and he starts writing down, and I couldn't figure out. I said, we didn't even need help. I said, everything had machines doing it. I said, Americans can invent anything. And he keeps nodding his head. He's just a kid. He's only probably 19. So I said, we didn't even have to pick up the chicken poop. I said, we had this automated machine, this robot, would go around and pick up all the chicken poop. And he looked at me, his eyes got one, and I said, we had this beautiful chicken poop machine. And I said, it was a marvelous thing. And one of the guys spoke up and he says, boy, you sure are certified. And I said, well, you guys just don't know how marvelous that machine was. Well, anyway, I thought it was just a goofy story, you know. And the next day, I'm called to the office. And our commanding officer of the prison was Odera Taisa. He had a handlebar mustache and was an old-time officer and a drunk. This is probably why, as a colonel, he was given a job of a prison camp. He spoke French also. But anyway, the interpreter was there, and he said to me, he says, we understand you are a poultry expert. The colonel wants to have his own chicken farm. And we are going to assign you as a chicken expert to teach the colonel how to raise his chickens. And I thought, good Lord, what's happened? The gravy train has arrived. And we had a rule, you never accepted anything that sounded too good. So I said, no, I can't do that. I says, my ancestors would never allow me to give away trade secrets. And so he just got furious. He said, you will do this, or you will be punished. And I said, well, since you put it that way, I think my ancestors would understand. So I got the job as a poultry expert for Colonel Derataisa. I was all by myself. I wasn't even in the prison. I had to go through the prison gate out to the Japanese compound. And here was this chicken farm, 20 some odd chickens. And I had to collect the eggs and turn the eggs in each day. Well, at first, I started eating 2 or 3 eggs raw every day. And I was afraid to cut the ration down too much because they'd be aware that I was stealing them. And then I got to thinking, it'd sure be great to have a hard-boiled egg. So I decided that I'm going to start swiping eggs and taking them into the barracks. So I made a little sack. I hung around my waist, hung down between my legs, and I'd put 2 eggs in them, in the sack, and I had to go through the gate and be searched and give my number. So I come to the guards at the gate when I go back into the prison, and I had to bow and say, my number, Niichi Juichi, and then they'd pat me down and then send me in. Well, I got away with it because they were a little careless in their search. So anyway, my chickens started laying like mad. And instead of getting 10 eggs, I was getting double that almost. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna take a few more chances. So I decided I'd steal 4 eggs at a time instead of 2. So I put 2 in the bag, and I put 2 on top of my head and put my hat down over them. And I just hoping that my hat wouldn't come off, because stealing from a colonel would have been a death sentence. So anyway, I got away with my 4-egg caper, got in. The next day, when I went out to the farm, to the chicken farm, here's Matsuo, the colonel's orderly, Colonel Deratice's orderly, and he says, "Shikoto nai." And so anyway, he said, "Don't work today, you yasame." So he told me to go back to the barracks. Well, I really started getting worried because he said he would collect the eggs. Well, instead of my usual number of eggs, there were quite a few more. Well, that night, I got a call to go to the office. And here's Odera Taisa and a table with Ishihara and a great big bowl, basket full of my eggs. And Odera Taisa has his saber, his great big samurai saber laying on the table. And the interpreter said to me, "Why is it when you don't work chicken farm that we get more eggs? And you're supposed to be the chicken expert." Well, during the time that I had been in the compound there in my section, I'd done a lot of thinking, and I came up with a con again. I figured, well, I conned them into the job in the first place. I'm going to con myself out of it. So I told them that I needed a blackboard and some chalk to explain why there were more eggs. Well, anyway, the colonel let me have this blackboard, and I had chalk, and I did this equation on it. And I told him it was all due to the molt. I said, chickens and laying and molting are very much related. And I said, this formula explains how the egg laying pattern will be. And I said, the secondary feather on the wings will be slightly longer when they're in the laying stage. Why? I went on explaining all this. And Ishihara, who understood English very well and hated us, he said, "What is this molt business?" And I thought, Oh, glory be. He doesn't understand chickens. So I thought, well, I can really elaborate on the story. So I went on and on and on, and I worked this formula out mathematically, and I pointed to the basket, and I told the colonel exactly how many brown eggs and how many white eggs they should get today. And the old colonel clapped his hands like that, and he says, "Heitai Ichiban, number one, Sergeant." I think he knew all the time it was a con, because he wasn't a stupid man. But he admired the fact that I was trying to put something over. And I don't think he liked the Ishihara, because the military didn't like their own civilians very much anyway. And to have a civilian put in their group with that kind of authority, was no good. But anyway, I got away with it. I remember one time the Japanese used to take maybe a 4 or 5 man squad with an officer and charge into our barracks to catch us playing cards or to pick up contraband. Anything that was unusual was contraband. In fact, if you had a pencil or a piece of paper, they would take that. Well, anyway, these guards would come in and they'd move us out of the barracks, and then they'd search the whole barracks, and they'd even climb up in the roof and the attic looking for radios and stuff like that, and antenna. But anyway, one of the guards took a ladder and got up on our roof. And he's up there, and another guard came by and took his ladder to another building. So he's ready to get down, so he starts calling to his buddies to put the ladder back. And the Japanese word for ladder is haushigo. So he's yelling at his buddies, and nobody's paying any attention to him. And I was walking along the side of the barracks there with a fellow I knew from North China, a Marine. I think he was from either Texas or Mississippi, somewhere down there, the southern boy. And this guard on the roof pointed down to him. He said, "You," to my buddy. He said, "How she go?" And this Texan looked up at him. He said, "It goes okay, you darn fool." Oh, we had to laugh. Near the end of the war, the Japanese knew they were losing, and they were afraid that their troops would be pushed out of the area where we were being held in Kangwon, near Shanghai. So they loaded us aboard prison trains, or a train, and they were the small gauge railroad. And in this boxcar, they had the center section by the door. They had wire from wall to wall, barbed wire, and there were 50 men there and 50 men in the other end of the car and 10 guards. And it was so crowded, there was straw on the floor. It was so crowded that only a couple of guys could lie down at once. You had to stand up or be on your knees so that you took up less space. So I took my pants off and tied my pants legs in a knot under my chin and hooked the pants up on a nail on the side of the boxcar. And I'd sleep that way with my head in the sling. So it was very, very boring, mile after mile of riding this train. So anyway, I got to thinking, we got to do something funny to shake things up a bit. So I told John Blandy, I says, "John, let's do something and really shake these guards up." And he says, what do you want to do? And I says, let's build a radio. So we got our Red Cross box and some empty tin cans and string, and we, I don't know where we got the charcoal, but we had a piece of charcoal, probably from one of the little burners we built. But anyway, we got up close to the wire, and the Japanese corporal said, "Naniga, naniga," you know, what are you going to do? And we said, we're going to build a radio, going to hear Tokyo, hear news on radio. And he said, baka, baka, that's fool, you know. And so we put our Red Cross box down, and Blandy then took a needle and thread and sewed on some big buttons for dials. And I wrote some numbers on it, and we had this wire, and we had two halves of a butter tin, and we put a string through the thing and down into the radio, into the box. And the guards are coming over there, and they're looking at us, and they're having a ball. They're laughing, they're baka, 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 you know. And so we said, okay, we're going to build this radio. What we didn't know that at that time, our bombers were hitting Japan almost on the hour, air raids. So anyway, and the Japanese were tuned to that station. So we had this guy in the back of the car, in behind some guys, that had a tin can, and he spoke fluent Japanese. So John says, he's all ready. And so I put the earphones on, and I start turning this button, and this buddy of mine with the tin can says, Tokyo, 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 Binijuku, Binijuku. Attack of 29s, B-29s. And at the same time, the Japanese are listening to the radio, and there is an actual attack of B-29s. So here I am, and this Japanese tries to grab my radio, and I pull back. I said, quiet, quiet. And this buddy of mine goes, all the static, and then boom, 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 bombs falling. Well, anyway, the corporal of our guard detail couldn't take it anymore, so he pulls the emergency stop handle. They stopped the train out in the middle of nowhere. They moved us out of the car, took us out, and set up a camp table. And they got our radio on it. And the interpreter comes over and he says, where is radio? I says, there's radio. That is not radio. I says, that's our radio. We know you have stolen radio somewhere, hidden radio. Where is radio? We heard same broadcast. So I thought, well, I'm going to go right along with this. I says, well, we got the news. I said, that's our radio. Impossible. And they kept us out there for at least an hour or more, questioning us where this radio was, and they're tearing this boxcar apart, trying to find this hidden radio. And we're laughing our heads off. Oh, they slapped us around. They didn't get the humor of it. The release from prison was a marvelous time. I remember it just like it was yesterday. We were in a prison camp. I was in Hakodate Branch 3 on the island of Hokkaido in northern Japan, the northernmost island of the island string. And we started to go to work that morning, and they brought us back in the camp and said, "Yasame, no work today, rest." And we noticed a lot of the Japanese guards were wiping tears out of their eyes. And they just looked awful. And so we knew something big was happening. And there was a guard that I knew that worked in the galley. Habisha was his first name. I said, "Habisha, what's happening?" And he said, "Hiroshima, Ichitsukogi, Ichiboom, Hiroshima Shimba." And I said, "You're crazy. One airplane and one bomb." He was telling me about the atomic bomb. And he says, "Ichiboom, Hiroshima." And he wiped tears out of his eye. Well, so then we had no idea what an atomic bomb was. And then later in the day, this huge flight of B-29s flew over us. And we thought, good Lord, they're going to bomb our camp, which they did in some cases in Japan. And the bomb bay doors opened, and these leaflets fell. And they were written in 3 different languages. And in English it said, "The Japanese government has surrendered." Then it explained to us to stay in our camps, and that food and medicine and clothing and all would be dropped to us later. And later in the day, Navy planes came over. And they started dropping these big 50-gallon drums of food and bales of clothing and medicine and stuff. And one of the drums came down. We had an area marked off, but they were missing. Some of the parachutes didn't open. And one parachute didn't open, and this huge drum came down, hit the ground, and split open. And it was full of gallon cans of peaches. And one of them hit a Wake Island sergeant who had gone through all that prison life, hit him in the back of the head and killed him. And we had Korean slave workers in another camp right by us. And 2 of the Korean workers were killed, and one dropped into our power supply. So it was really a hectic time. We got all this clothing and medicines and food, and of course, being so hungry, we immediately started eating American food. And we all got sick. Couldn't take it. Too sweet, too salty, couldn't stand it. So our cooks had to take our American rations that we got from the Navy and incorporate them with our rice and our soup that we were used to. The first thing I did after I had enough to eat was to get clean. It was almost impossible to keep clean. So I had clean underwear. I hadn't had any underwear for 3 years, or socks. I took my brand new socks and underwear and uniform, and I went over to the Japanese officers' bathhouse. They had all gone. They took off. And I soaked up, got in the big tub and laid there and soaked and shaved. I hadn't shaved for ages. Got myself all back in shape again, shaved and good clean clothes. And then I had this intense desire to get out of the camp. So there were no guards on the gate. So I gathered up a pair of shoes that were too small for me, brand new shoes, and some candy. And I threw them in a bag, and a buddy and I decided we're going to go out and visit the villagers. I just wanted contact with other people. And immediately, a bunch of the kids of the village started following us, so we gave them candy. And we're having a ball. And the civilians are treating us like we were just part of their group, you know. And so we had a nice visit with these villagers. And then I came along, and there's an old man sitting on the curb. And he doesn't have any shoes. And I thought, well, what the heck? So I took my shoe that I had, and I gave them to him. And he gets up and starts bowing to me and thanking me. And we spent the whole day just roaming around that village, being in contact with people. It was just amazing how good it was. I got the feeling, you know, that my hatred wasn't really intense anymore. I came back to the camp, and our own colors are flying over the camp on the flagpole. And what had happened was some of the guys had taken parachutes, different colored, and made an American flag. And so we stayed in the camp until about the 12th of September. I think it was September. And then we were told to go to Sapporo for evacuation. And the next morning, after we were told this, we boarded a train for Sapporo. And this is the funniest thing. I have no memory at all of leaving the prison. And I left my bundle of letters that I'd probably read 1,000 times. And I can't figure it out. I was very ill with asthma. And I think what happened is I just was so ill I have no recollection. But one of my buddies later on told me that we marched out of the camp counting off. Left, my wife and 24 kids, left. It was one of the cadence we used to sing. Anyway, we marched down to the railroad station and boarded a train and went to Sapporo. I have no memory of the trip, getting on the train or anything, and my memory starts at Sapporo. And at Sapporo, we were taken aboard aircraft, and the pilot flew down towards Tokyo, and when he flew over, I guess it was Hiroshima, it might have been Nagasaki, but anyway, and he told us there was where the atomic bomb had been dropped. And I looked down, and it's all blackened, terrible sight. So we went towards the airport at Tokyo, and couldn't land because of fog. So we went back to Sapporo, and there was a small carrier tied up at the docks. So they took us aboard this carrier, the Kitsumbe. And from there, I was taken to Guam, where I spent time recuperating. And I was on Guam about 9 days in the hospital. I was very sick. I felt like I could walk. So I told the nurse that I'd like to take and go up to the Marine Air Station. And it was about a mile. And so she gave me permission to go and told me to be careful of snipers, because there were still Japanese snipers even at this point, back in the hills in Guam. So I went up to the Marine Corps Air Station, the Naval Air Station, and on the gate, the entrance was a sign, Commanding Officer Tyler, Colonel Tyler, a full bird, and Executive Officer Stanley Pittman. And I just couldn't believe it, because Tyler was a captain when I first knew him. And Stanley Pittman was one of my corporals. I overranked him. So I went in, and Stanley is at the outer desk of his colonel. And he looks up and he says, "My gosh, Bourquin, we thought you were dead." He says, "Colonel, get out here." And the colonel came out, and we used to call him Tiny. He was a great big heavy guy. And we had a very close relationship of enlisted men and officers. We had nicknames for each other. Anyway, I says, "How are you, Tiny?" And he says, "Well, I'm a full bird now." He pointed his shoulder. And he says, "Good gosh, we thought you were dead." So anyway, and I told Stanley, "Oh, he's a major." And last I knew him, he was a corporal. He was in a different group. So anyway, the colonel gave me his car and a chauffeur, and and then I met him at the club, officers' club, and had dinner with him. And he gave me the car to go anywhere I wanted on the island. So he took me back to the hospital, and the colonel said, he says, "Stand by, close by a telephone, because in the next day or so, I'll be giving you a call." He says, "We're going to get you out of here by aircraft." So I thought I was going to have to wait and get on a ship, be 15 days. But the next day, I had a telephone call, and it was the colonel. He says, "Put on a shirt that doesn't have any chevrons, no sergeant chevrons or markings, and get your gear and get up here as soon as possible." He says, "I bumped a guy on a flight to the States." And he says, "It's yours." So I went up the airfield, boarded this old DC-3, I think it was. And it was full of admirals and captains, all kinds of brass that almost knock your eyes out, brass all over the place. And here I am, a lowly sergeant. And I took a seat, and right next to me was Charlie Ruggles, the movie star. And I looked over at him, I said, "For gosh sakes, you're Charlie Ruggles." And he says, "Yes." And he introduced one of the ladies in the back, Mary Bryan, who's an old B star. So I started talking to Charlie, and he told me he was very tired. He'd been on tour, USO tour. And he'd like to sleep, so he slept. I started talking to Mary Bryan and a sailor. There was one enlisted sailor, Seaman Howard, that had been given special permission to take his 2 children home. And what had happened, Seaman Howard was aboard a ship at Guam when the war broke out. So they left the harbor. He was married to a Guamanian girl and had 2 children, 2 little children, just infants. And the Japanese sunk his ship and captured him. So he never saw his wife or children for all the 4 years he was in prison. And when he was released, he was taken back to Guam to be reunited with his family, and found out his wife had been executed by the Japanese because she wouldn't become a love slave, they called him, of the Japanese officers. So they took her out and beheaded her. And the 2 children had grown up somewhat, and the grandparents raised the kids. So Howard had to come back to the fact that his wife had been beheaded. But anyway, he got the two kids back to the States, and the last I heard, they were doing fine, you know, and it's as bad as the fellow was killed with the peaches. It's hard to think, you know, of those things. When I got home back in 1945, Charlotte and I got married. We bought a new house, or bought our home in Seattle, and applied to go to the University of Washington under the GI Bill. But they were full and couldn't accept us. So we moved to Corvallis, Oregon, and entered Oregon State. And I would never have gone back to school if it hadn't been for Charlotte. We were at a Pike Street market one day when we were shopping, and I had a job with the Seattle Park Department. It was a job that was going nowhere. And she said, "Bob, I want you to go to college and get a profession." And I told her I was too dumb. She said, "Well, I'll go back to school with you and help you." So she went 3 years and worked at a job afterwards, quit college, and worked at a job to get me through. So I did my 4 years of college, and then I did a year of postgraduate work and got my general secondary teaching credential. I loved teaching even more than I loved being a sergeant in the Marines. The kids were great and never had problems, discipline. I just would tell them the way it was going to be, and that was it. Just a wonderful life, and 27 years, and just loved it. Looking back on my life, I feel I've been very fortunate. I'm now 91. Charlotte and I had 65 years, just lacking a couple months of life together. We had a beautiful daughter who died of cystic fibrosis when she was almost 10. Then we adopted our son, Jeffrey, which was a marvelous thing. We had such a blessing in getting Jeffrey. But all in all, I would say that I've had more good in my life, my 91 years, than I've had bad. And I would like to impress on young people the idea that the freedom we have as Americans is a very precious thing. They got to be willing to stand up and fight for it. It looks like we're going through a terrible time right now. And people, I think, have to be very strong and stick to their Constitution and their idea of a fair democracy. I just pray that they'll have the courage to do this.